You open the door, and it hits you before you even see anything. Not a memory. A smell. Something between oil and smoke and something sweet underneath it. Something you have never quite been able to name. You are standing in a shed, or a garage, or a lean-to at the bottom of a garden somewhere in England, and your father is somewhere in there, half hidden by a workbench, and for a second you are 7 years old again. Look around, and the details start coming back on their own. A pegboard on the far wall, with the outline of every spanner drawn round it in marker pen, so you always knew exactly which tool had gone missing. A row of old jam jars, screwed lid first to a shelf, each one holding a different size of screw or washer, sorted with a care your father never applied to anything else in the house. A calendar, years out of date, still pinned up from a garage, or a parts supplier that probably does not exist anymore. Somewhere, almost certainly, a radio tuned permanently to one station, filling the silences between the clink of tools with a low, constant murmur. That smell is gone now. Not gone from your memory. Gone from the world. Ask a teenager today to describe what a garage smells like, and they will look at you blankly, because most garages today smell like nothing at all, or like the inside of a car dealership. Clean, odorless, safe. Today we are going to take that smell apart, layer by layer, ingredient by ingredient, and tell you exactly what it was made of. Some of it will make you smile. Long. Some of it by the end will make you look at your father's old workshop a little differently. Because that smell was not just nostalgia. It was chemistry. And some of that chemistry had a cost that nobody told you about at the time. Let's start with the thing your hands remember before your nose does. That thick green, faintly citrus paste your dad kept on a shelf by the door, in a tub with a screw lid gone slightly sticky around the rim. Sawdust. If you grew up anywhere near an engineering trade, a garage, or a father who fixed his own car, you know this substance intimately. It was invented in 1947 by a chemist named Audley Bowdler Williamson, working in Derbyshire. Williamson had already spent years in the detergent trade, and what he came up with was something genuinely clever, a gel-like thixotropic paste, meaning it behaved like a solid until you worked it between your palms, at which point it turned fluid enough to lift grease, oil, and grime straight off the skin without a drop of water. Think about what that meant, practically, for a working man in 1950, 1960, 1970, hands blackened from an engine block, knuckles split from a spanner slipping, and no easy way to get properly clean before dinner. Sawdust solved that, and it left behind a smell that decades later still means your father has been working more clearly than almost anything else could. Think too about the tub itself. That slightly tacky lid, the way the paste never quite came off the rim no matter how carefully you wiped it, the faint orange or green tint left on a flannel by the sink. These are the kinds of details that never made it into any history book, and yet they are exactly the details your body remembers. The moment something similar crosses your path in a hardware shop. But that was only the cleaning up smell. The working smell came from somewhere else entirely. Reach for the tool drawer, and you would find a small tin, red and black, with a long thin spout, half rusted at the base. 3-in-1 oil. The name itself was a promise. It would clean, it would lubricate, it would protect, all from one can. It had actually been formulated much earlier than most people assume, back in 1894, by an inventor named George W. Cole, originally meant for bicycle chains. But by the time it reached your father's generation, it had become something closer to a universal ritual. A squeaky hinge got a drop. A stiff bicycle chain got a drop. A rusted padlock, a stubborn drawer runner, a lawnmower wheel. That faintly metallic, faintly sweet smell followed every single one of those small repairs, and it clung to fingertips for hours afterward, no matter how much sawdust you used on them. And somewhere near that tin of oil, resting against the wall or hung on a nail, there was very likely a folding workbench with a strange, slightly ingenious clamping top. If your father owned one, he owned a Black & Decker workmate, and the story behind it is stranger than most people realize. It was invented not by a career tool designer, but by a car stylist named Ron Hickman, a South African who had moved to Britain in the 1950s, and gone on to design the Lotus Elan. In 1961, building a wardrobe at home, Hickman used an expensive chair as an improvised sawhorse and promptly sawed straight through one of its legs. Frustrated, he designed a portable folding bench with a top that opened into a makeshift vise. Every major manufacturer he approached turned him down. One famously told him the potential market could be measured in dozens rather than thousands. So Hickman built and sold them himself, out of his own small company, through mail order and trade shows, until Black & Decker finally changed their minds and signed an exclusive deal in the early 1970s. Within a couple of decades, tens of millions had been sold worldwide. And the Workmate became one of the defining objects of the British DIY boom that took hold through the 1970s and 80s. As home ownership rose, and doing your own repairs, rather than paying a tradesman, became something close to a national pastime. If you ever helped your father unfold one of those benches on a Saturday morning, hearing that particular clack of the frame locking into place, you were standing at the tail end of a very ordinary, very British story about persistence paying off. Look further along that pegboard, and the tools themselves carried their own quiet history. A handsaw stamped Spear and Jackson meant it had come from a company tracing back to 1760, when a partnership between Alexander Spear and a Sheffield businessman named John Love began producing saws from crucible steel, at a time when Sheffield itself was becoming the center of Britain's steel and tool trade. By the time that saw reached your father's shed, it represented roughly 200 years of continuous manufacturing in the same English city, passed from firm to firm, generation to generation, largely unchanged in its basic design because the design had simply been right from very early on. There is something worth sitting with in that. The tools in these sheds were often older, in terms of their design lineage, than the shed itself, than the house, sometimes than the entire street. Now picture the season changing. Picture October, coming into the shed on a Saturday morning, breath visible in the air, and your father is somewhere in there, half hidden by a workbench, and your father crouched by a squat metal heater in the corner, striking a match. That heater ran on paraffin, and if you are picturing a specific orange glow and a specific low hiss right now, you already know the smell that came next. There were two rival systems fighting for space in British homes and workshops through the middle of the century. On one side, Aladdin heaters running on pink paraffin, a fuel sold by BP and Shell mechs. On the other, Valor heaters burning SO Blue, made by the Anglo-American Oil Company. Families tended to be loyal to one brand or the other, almost the way people are loyal to a football club. And the fuel came home in a heavy metal can, refilled weekly at the ironmonger, the garage, or sometimes the grocer. Lighting one of these heaters filled a small enclosed shed with a rich, oily, slightly acrid warmth, thick enough that you could taste it at the back of your throat. It was, for a huge number of working-class and middle-class British households, the only heat available in an unheated outbuilding. And it is, for anyone who grew up around one, an unmistakable part of what workshop smells like. Step outside the shed itself, and the same rituals continued under the bonnet of the family car, usually parked on the drive or half in the garage with its nose sticking out. Through the 1960s and into the 1970s, British roads were dominated by cars built by British Leyland. The conglomerate formed in 1968 out of Austin, Morris, Triumph, and several other British manufacturers, alongside Ford's own homegrown models built at Dagenham. These were cars that broke down often enough, and were simple enough mechanically, that an ordinary father with a decent set of spanners could realistically keep one running himself for years, rather than handing every problem straight to a garage. Sunday mornings across the country followed a familiar shape. Bonnet up, sleeves rolled, a search for the source of a rattle or a leak, and often a trip underneath the car itself, out of sight except for two legs sticking out from beneath the chassis. Underneath all of that sat something older and heavier still. Wood. Specifically wood that had been treated with creosote, a thick, near-black tar distillate brushed onto fence panels, shed walls and workbenches to stop rot from setting in. Creosote has a smell that does not fade. It seeps into timber and stays there for years, releasing a sharp, smoky, almost medicinal odor every time the sun warmed the wood through a small window. Combine that with sawdust curling off a hand plane, and with linseed oil worked into a wooden handle to stop it from splitting, and you start to understand why that shed smell was never one single thing. It was decades of small, repeated, deliberate acts of maintenance, each one leaving its own chemical signature behind. There is a reason so many British men of that generation retreated to a shed or a garage rather than staying in the house. It was rarely explained and almost never discussed directly, but the shed served a purpose that had very little to do with fixing bicycles or servicing cars. It was one of the only places a man was allowed to simply be quiet. No conversation required, no performance of being fine. Just a task in front of him, a radio murmuring in the background, and enough noise from a drill or a hacksaw to make silence feel like a choice rather than an absence. Entire unspoken feelings, worries about money, about work, about a marriage under strain, were processed in that shed, one small repair at a time, without either party ever having to name what was actually going on. That is worth remembering, because it changes what the smell actually represents. It is not simply the smell of hobbies. For a great many men of that era, who had grown up with a very narrow idea of what they were permitted to feel out loud, the shed was the closest thing they had to a private room of their own, decades before that kind of conversation became acceptable in an ordinary household. Before we go further into what that smell was actually doing to the men who breathed it every weekend for 30 years, I want you to do something for me. If any part of this is bringing back a specific memory right now, hit subscribe, and while you are there, drop that memory in the comments. Now, the smoke. Because in most of these workshops, somewhere in among the oil and the paraffin and the tar, there was a pipe going or a hand-rolled cigarette balanced on the edge of a vise. Two names dominate here, and both have history stretching back further than you might expect. Old Holborn traces its origins to 1785, when a tobacco blender named Richard Lloyd set up shop in the Holborn district of London, at the center of a city that had become one of the great tobacco trading hubs of the era. By the 20th century, Old Holborn had become one of the most recognizable hand-rolling tobaccos in the country, its dark Virginia blend a fixture in donkey jacket pockets and workshop drawers across Britain. The other name is St. Bruno, first marketed in 1896 by Thomas Ogden, a Liverpool tobacconist who had opened his first shop decades earlier during the city's boom years as a trading port. St. Bruno became, for an enormous number of British men, simply pipe tobacco, full stop, no further explanation required. Its slightly sweet, faintly fermented aroma, sometimes described as having a vinegar-like tang from its curing process, mixed with engine oil and sawdust into something that you could probably identify blindfolded even now. And every pipe, every roll-up, needed lighting, which usually meant a small box of Swan Vestas rattling around in a coat pocket or a drawer. The brand had started life in 1883 as a compact wax match, was bought up by Bryant and May in 1901, and rebranded under the Swan Vestas name in 1906. By the 1930s it had become, by most accounts, Britain's best-selling match, marketed for decades under the tagline "The Smoker's Match," and that particular rasp of a match striking against the side of a box, followed a half-second later by sulfur, is arguably as much a part of that shed's memory as anything you could squeeze out of a tin. So that is the smell, broken down, Swarfaga, 3-in-1 oil, paraffin, in one of two rival colors, creosote, sawdust and linseed, pipe smoke, 6 ingredients, each one perfectly ordinary on its own, none of them looking remotely dangerous sitting on a shelf. Put them all together in an enclosed, poorly ventilated wooden shed, and you get something else entirely. Here is the part nobody tells you when they get misty-eyed about the smell of Dad's workshop. Paraffin heaters like the Aladdin and the Valor were, by modern safety standards, genuinely hazardous. Burned in a small unventilated space, they consumed the oxygen in that room and released carbon monoxide alongside the fumes you could smell. People of that generation often describe running one in a bathroom for 10 minutes before a bath, or leaving one lit in a shed for hours at a stretch, with no idea that a slow, invisible gas was building up around them. Creosote itself, the substance responsible for that deep tarry note in the smell, is now recognized as containing compounds linked to skin and respiratory harm, which is exactly how an entire generation of British men applied it. No gloves, no mask, no second thought, and underneath all of it sat two much larger, much quieter threats. Leaded petrol had been standard in Britain since the 1920s, added to boost engine performance. The fuel was not fully banned from general sale until the very end of 1999, and brake linings and clutch plates fitted to countless family cars right through those same decades were commonly made using asbestos, a material men handled directly while grinding, sanding, and replacing worn parts, while that paraffin heater hissed away in the corner. None of these men knew at the time what they were breathing in. There was no warning label on a tin of pink paraffin that mentioned carbon monoxide. There was no leaflet in the ironmongers telling you that the brake dust on your hands after a Sunday afternoon under the car was anything other than dirt to be scrubbed off with a bit of Swarfager before tea. The regulations that eventually restricted lead-in fuel, controlled the use of asbestos, and forced proper ventilation standards onto small heating appliances did not arrive out of nowhere. They arrived because slowly, over decades, doctors and researchers started connecting patterns of illness in exactly this generation of men back to exactly these ordinary Saturday afternoons. That is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all that nostalgia. The workshop smell you miss so much was in part the smell of a world that had not yet worked out what was safe and what was not. It was not recklessness. Nobody was being careless on purpose. It was simply what everybody did, because it was what everybody had always done, and the science had not caught up yet to tell them otherwise. The turning point, at least on paper, came in 1988, when the control of substances hazardous to health regulations, known ever since by the shorthand COSAH, were introduced across Britain. For the first time, employers were legally required to properly assess and control exactly the kind of everyday hazardous exposure that had, until then, simply been treated as part of the job. It is a strange thing to sit with. An entire generation of fathers had already spent 20, 30, 40 years breathing in paraffin fumes, brake dust, and leaded residue before the law caught up enough to even ask the question of whether that was acceptable. The workshop did not become safer because the smell suddenly changed. It became safer because, slowly, the country finally admitted that the smell had been a warning sign all along. So why, knowing all that, do so many of us still ache for that smell the second we catch even a trace of it? Walking past a hardware shop, or opening a box of old tools that belonged to a grandfather we barely remember. Because the smell was never really the point. The smell was just the wrapping paper around something else. Something that had almost nothing to do with chemistry. It was the sound of your father not talking very much, but somehow explaining everything anyway, just by letting you stand close enough to watch him work. It was being handed a rag and told to hold something steady, and understanding without either of you saying it out loud that you had just been trusted with something. It was watching a broken thing become a working thing again, through nothing but patience and a handful of ordinary tools, and slowly absorbing the idea that most problems can be fixed if you are willing to get your hands dirty and take your time. That is what an entire generation of British fathers passed down in those sheds and garages, almost by accident, without ever calling it an education. How to bleed a brake line, how to true a bicycle wheel, how to know just by the sound an engine made that something was wrong before it broke down completely. None of it was written anywhere. All of it lived in that smell, in that room, standing in a modern garage that smells like nothing at all, wishing desperately that it smelled like something. Think about how strange that actually is, when you say it out loud. A man who might never once have told you he loved you, not in those words, not directly, could hand you a torch and ask you to hold it steady over an engine bay for 20 minutes without complaint. And somehow that felt like enough. Being trusted with a task, however small, however dull, was the closest some fathers of that generation ever came to saying anything tender at all. If you understood that then, you were unusually lucky. Most of us only understand it now, looking back, piecing it together the way we are doing right this moment. And there is a particular kind of grief that comes with a smell like this, one that has nothing to do with anyone actually being gone. Even if your father is still here, Even if that exact shed is still standing at the bottom of a garden somewhere, the smell itself has quietly retired. The paraffin heaters are unplugged and sold on for pennies at car boot sales. The tin of Swarfager has been replaced in most households by a bottle of something odorless from under the kitchen sink. The tobacco tin sits empty on a shelf. You can lose an entire sensory world even while every person connected to it is still alive. And that is a strange, quiet kind of loss that nobody really warns you about. None of this is an argument for bringing back leaded petrol or asbestos brake pads, and I doubt anyone genuinely wants that. But there is a difference between the dangerous chemistry of that world and the human behavior that happened to take place inside it, and it would be a shame to let the first one erase the second entirely from memory. The lesson is not things were better then. The lesson is closer to this. An ordinary man, with ordinary tools, in an ordinary shed, built something that mattered enormously to the people around him, almost without trying, simply by being present and unhurried for an hour or two most weekends. If you had that kind of workshop growing up, or if you built one yourself for your own children, you already understand something important. The tools change. The products get safer, thankfully. The paraffin heaters disappear, and honestly, good riddance to the carbon monoxide. But the thing underneath all of it, a grown man taking the time to show a child how something works, patiently, without rushing, without a phone in his pocket demanding his attention, that does not have to disappear at all. That part is still entirely up to you. So here is what I would ask of you before you go. Tell me in the comments below exactly what your father's workshop smelled like. Not generally, specifically, the brand of oil, the exact tin, the particular corner where he kept his tobacco. I want the details, because those details are exactly what we are losing, one generation at a time, and putting them into words here is one small way of keeping them alive. If this brought back a memory you had not thought about in years, give it a like, so more people who grew up the same way can find it. Share it with your father, if he is still around to receive it, or with a brother or sister who remembers that same shed the way you do. And if you have not already, subscribe, because there are a great many more of these ordinary, overlooked smells and sounds from a vanished Britain still waiting to be pulled apart, one Saturday afternoon at a time.